Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 43 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Paul the Jew, Part 2. In the previous episode, we began looking at Paula Fredriksen's 2022 article, What Does It Mean to See Paul Within Judaism?, that was published in the Journal of Biblical Literature. Today, we continue looking at that piece, beginning with a section entitled, Jews and Everybody Else. Fredriksen opens with what may seem like two softball questions. Who were the Jews, and who was everybody else? To address the former, she considers some of the things that Paul says about himself in his letters. He's an Israelite, per Romans chapter 9, verse 3. A Benjamite, per Romans chapter 11, verse 1. A Hebrew born to Hebrews, and circumcised on the 8th day following his birth, per Philippians chapter 3, verse 5. Paul was a Jew. What made Jews unique when compared to the Greeks or Romans was their particular ethno-religious patrimonies, to use Fredriksen's words. Drawing from Romans chapter 9 verses 3 through 5, Fredriksen lists a few, though two stand out. God's glorious presence, implied by the articular he dagza, the glory, and specific cultic etiquette, a la the Greek noun he latreia, the worship. Together, these two terms point to Jerusalem, the holy city wherein one could find the temple to Israel's God. This suggests, then, the importance of the temple to Paul. Paul also mentions things like the adoption, and the covenants and the promises, all unique to Jews. These things made the Jews who they were, just as for other groups, their particular practices made them who they were. Fredriksen writes, For ancient people, ethnicity marked, indeed caused, national culture and character. It was part of their physis, nature. It made them egenos, a nation or people group. But ethnicities were not these clear-cut boundaries that no one transgressed. Living in Greco-Roman cities entailed exposure to a variety of different types of people, their style of clothing, jewelry, food, and perhaps most important of all, worship. This resulted in a variety of cultural appropriation. To quote Fredriksen, Greeks could Persianize, Romans could Judaize, Jews could Hellenize or foreignize. Peoples as well as their gods might meet, mix, and mingle. Jews living in the diaspora, away from Jerusalem, often became like their pagan counterparts in particular ways, and Fredriksen lists a few examples. Joining professional guilds and eating with non-Jewish colleagues, hiring pagan magicians, summoning Greek deities as witnesses when a slave was manumitted, and even having their circumcised genitals repaired to appear uncircumcised. For Fredriksen, this data reveals something very important. She writes, These various modalities of Hellenizing point to a larger fact, the very various modalities of Jewishness. Different Jews enacted Jewishness differently. To put it another way, there was no such thing as Judaism in the Second Temple period, but Judaisms, plural. She also notes that non-Jews would sometimes Judaize, joining in with Jewish groups to celebrate feast days. Some became patrons of synagogues, offering monetary support for projects. For the more serious, pork was avoided, and some even underwent proselyte circumcision. These were not quite Jews in the traditional sense. Some scholars refer to them as converts, but even this is not entirely satisfactory. For Fredriksen, all of this demonstrates that people groups could adopt some of the customs of others while still retaining their own distinctive ones. This included non-Jews, who looked at Jewish practices and chose to adopt some of them. This exposure to non-Jews in some ways desensitized Jews to their presence. Fredriksen writes, "In other words, for most Jews most of the time, pagans were simply normal. They comprised, after all, the vast majority of humankind." And it is this context that is vital to understanding Paul within Judaism. If variety is the spice of life, then the early Jesus movement was blazing hot. Fredriksen observes that there was significant debate over what constituted the gospel, especially as it pertained to non-Jews. The original movement was homogeneous, all Jews. But as apostles were sent out to the diaspora to reach Jews there, they necessarily went to synagogues, where they encountered pagans who were showing interest in Judaism. Some, invariably, were attracted to this new iteration of Judaism that proclaimed a crucified Jewish peasant was the Messiah of Israel, set to rule from Jerusalem over the nations. But what would their relationship be to the movement? Some taught they must be circumcised, but Paul disagreed. What these ex-pagans needed was, in Fredriksen's words, eschatological transformation. But she notes circumcision couldn't do it. Only pneuma, or spirit, specifically God's, could do that. Does this mean that Paul didn't want these ex-pagans to Judaize? Not by any means. He wanted them to Judaize in a very particular way. First, they had to abandon their gods and turn to Yahweh alone. They also had to abandon idols, since Yahweh was not to be represented by any figure. They also had to avoid a host of bad behaviors, like fornication, murder, and the like. In short, these ex-pagans were to become keepers of some of the Torah, but not all. And this is important because of how Paul is typically depicted as one preaching a law-free gospel. He wasn't. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.